Okay, for the last of this set of videos on sort of economic systems, we're going to be looking at a set of concepts that actually aren't in the text. They're scattered in other parts of the text, but it makes more sense to put them in here because they're economically driven and they usually are used when you're talking about economic issues. Now, the first of these goes back to our theory part. One of the huge theoreticians in the last 200 or 300 years has been Karl Marx. Actually, Marx and Engels are these two guys. They're both economic historians. They're around in the first half of the 19th century, for 1840s, 1860s. They're around at a point in time that change is just absolutely radical. Even by modern concepts, the change that occurs in the early part of the 19th century, from 1800 say to 1850, is absolutely enormous, much more so than we've experienced in the last 40 or 50 years. And that what you have is basically in Western Europe, where these guys are, sort of doing their stuff. You get an almost complete change from agriculturally based, sort of, if you would, primary based economies to economies where enormous parts of the population suddenly literally find themselves in maybe the space of 5 or 10 years, moving from being a farmer or a sheep herder or a rancher or something like that into production, working in the factory. This is the period of the great industrialization and factory building of both Europe and North America. This is when it starts. And the dislocation is stunning. The dislocation in countries like England, for example, is probably the most famous of the Industrial Revolution. It's just sort of mind-blowing. And huge parts of the population literally just sort of wake up one morning and find out that they've been evicted from their land as farmers, and now they've got to go find a job in a factory. They have no education, they're not literate, and they have no idea what they're talking about because they've never experienced anything like that. Everyone's always been a farmer. So, these enormous changes are occurring in European societies. And one of the side effects is the political system's collapse. The European system between the end of Napoleon, say in 1815 and 1840, all sorts of new countries pop up, monarchies collapse, all these, economic, not only the social turmoil taking place and economic turmoil taking place, but all sorts of political turmoil is taking place. Now, in most cases, it's not actually generated by warfare. What's happening is the economic systems change so radically, as a lot of your traditional power elites were based in the control of property. They weren't the ones that were investing in factories. So when you get people making factories and starting this new system of the Industrial Revolution, that's an entirely new chunk of the population that's coming to wealth and power that wasn't part of the, sort of landed establishment. And you can still see this in places like England and France and such, where you still have remnants of the old, landed aristocracy, the British royal family, for example. And then you have all the people that made money in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries with factories and stuff like that. Branson, Virgin Airlines would be a perfect example. And then what you have is, these two groups are basically competing for power and control. And this causes an enormous amount of political, social dislocation because all the population's moving around. No one knows what's going on. So Marx and Engels are basically, starting their work in this period. And they originally were interested in, of course, they're historians. They're economic historians. So they're trying to look at the past, but they get so distracted by what's going on in the world around them that more and more they get caught up in trying to explain what's happening in the Europe they live in versus getting all hung up on what Europe was 1,000 years before. Because they realize that they're right in the middle of this enormous change that's occurring. They decide that this change is actually driven by two related principles, both which are purely economic. And these are concepts that, even though part of Marx's Engels theory is sort of flopped, the basic principles in terms of these two principles, and especially the dialectic, which we'll get into in a sec, are still very, very valuable because they're, of all these sort of, theoretical traditions that start up, this has some very unique aspects to it in the fact that it tends to look at things in a very, very different way. And it's very, very useful, especially in the changes we see right now in the 2020s. So Marx's basically principle was that production and labor drove change, and production and labor drove economics. And so the definition of the two terms, they're real simple. It's the application as in much stuff. It's the application that gets tricky, or if you would, the interpretation. Production is very simply, well, let's do it in order. Labor very simply is the amount of energy that it takes to complete the production process. So if you go back to the analogy I gave last time on the little mine that you're digging up iron ore in, the labor cost would not only be the cost of, the equipment that's used to dig the mine and dig the ore out, it would also be the shipping of the ore. It would be the processing of that ore into iron. It would be then taking it to a factory that turns it into forks and spoons or whatever like that. And then it would also be the shipment of those where they're finally consumed. So the entire sort of labor involved in making a spoon would not only just be, taking a piece of metal and stamping it into that shape, it would be the entire process from digging the stuff out of the ground as iron ore. So that's labor. That's a tremendously useful concept when you look at it's the totality of energy cost of production. And especially in a world right now where you're concerned about, global issues and climate change and all sorts of stuff like that, understanding the real energy cost of something, because this labor doesn't just include human cost. It includes things like, fossil fuels or electricity, whatever is being used anywhere along this chain to convert something is part of the actual labor of the production process. And this is like I said, this is a tremendously powerful concept that really is not used very much. When people talk about even things like dealing with climate change, they very rarely actually look at the actual energy audit, if you would, of a product. I mean, you have to do that. Solar panels are a classic case in point. Solar panels are quite expensive in terms of energy to produce. They take a lot of labor, and they're a very complicated process that involves a whole mess of different type of things. So, the idea that you're somehow replacing something that's more polluting on one hand might be true, but if you actually look at the entire labor process, maybe the whole labor process of making a solar panel actually generates more pollution than the thing that you're trying to replace. So labor is a tremendously powerful concept that really should be used a lot more than it is. Geographers use it, economists use it sometimes, but the geographers are the ones that use it the most because we use it to actually map out energy cost. Production is the other half of the concept, and basically this is the process that I mentioned earlier. This is the process of then converting something from its raw form, in other words, lumps of iron dug out of the ground, into its final consumed form, where someone buys a spoon. That whole process is called production. So obviously the two are related. Production is the actual process where you describe the different layers, like I just did, of where it goes from original primary form to final consumed form. Labor is the amount of energy it takes to achieve that. If you map out something, and a perfect example would be this little highlighter right here. This is an incredibly complex thing if you look at labor and production. This is originally as largely fossil fuels. This is a plastic, and plastic comes from fossil fuels. There's a felt, I assume, in the middle that holds the liquid. Felt comes from sheep, it's wool. You've got whatever the liquid's made of, we'll just assume there's some sort of mineral involved in that, maybe oils. So, when you go and buy one of these things somewhere, the actual production from literally oil coming out of the ground, from sheep running around the countryside, from wherever you're digging up the stuff to make the liquid out of, all of that is a tremendously complicated process. And then the labor it takes to actually achieve all those, the amount of energy, especially, energy in terms of polluting energy to make a highlighter can probably be pretty stunning. And I'm sure people have probably done their dissertation on this, but you don't think about it. If you need a highlighter, you go down to Long's and you buy a set of them. So again, remember this is that disconnect I was talking about. Marx was actually talking about that in the 1840s, that there was a disconnect between labor and production and consumption. People who were consuming things did not know, and in many cases didn't want to know, what the actual production of labor costs were. But especially in today's world, you have to understand those concepts, or else you're going to literally, eat yourself off a planet. Outsourcing is a interesting part of this process because one of the side effects of what Marx was talking about, if you're dealing with a commodity consumer-based system, when you've got a factory in Arizona making these highlighters, then one of the things you get into is if someone starts up another factory making exactly the same product in, say, China, and you're buying these from Long's, CVS, then what's going to happen is Long's wants to maximize their profits. So they'll buy the ones that are made in China because they can buy them a lot cheaper. They'll sell them for a little cheaper. More people will buy the highlighters, and Long's CVS will make more money. Now, what happens then is the company that has the factory in Arizona can either go out of business because they can't sell them anymore, or what they can do is they can take their factory and they can move it to Vietnam because the labor is cheaper there. So their entire labor cost is lower. And now they can compete with the Chinese, brand, and now they can go and get their market back. And now you're buying them from the guys in Arizona. The control is still in Arizona. So our quaternary sector, the guys who manage it and design on the products and do the advertising, they're probably still based in Arizona somewhere. But the actual factory has now been outsourced. And in fact, in most cases, what will happen is guys won't move the factory. They'll actually contact someone in Vietnam who makes something like this, and then basically farm out and say, hey, can you guys make these for us? Okay, so that's what we call outsourcing. Outsourcing is when you move part of your production cycle from one location to another location, and it's almost invariably driven by labor cost. In many cases, it'll be human labor cost. So you move it to where human labor is the cheapest. And right now, that's still sort of Vietnam, Malaysia, and stuff. It was China 10 or 15 years ago, but the Chinese workforce has had increasing demands on what they get paid and how hard they work. And so that's now moving further into Southeast Asia, and it's going to move somewhere else. India is the other great source for, cheap labor. But it also includes energy cost. So for example, if you've got the factory in Arizona, you might save as much money moving that factory down to Mexico, where the energy costs are a lot lower because you don't have the same environmental regulations. The cost of fossil fuels is lower, so you can save a bunch of money that way, even though your actual labor costs in terms of what you pay people might not be that different. So you have to remember, if you're looking at the entire energy cost of production, i.e. labor, there's a whole mess of different ways you can teach that. But outsourcing basically is the idea that you're moving somewhere to increase the amount of money you're making off a product and basically lower the cost of making it. And this occurs in a ton of different ways. This is why the United States is at a huge disadvantage, because labor costs in the United States are incredibly high in just about every factor, from energy cost to human cost, all that stuff. So what that means is most of your companies in the United States don't actually have any production in the United States. Their production is somewhere else. It might be Mexico, might be Sri Lanka, might be India, might be China, might be Vietnam. I would be really shocked if almost anything you buy at a Walmart store actually comes from the United States, unless it's somehow marketed as American. But outsourcing is how you work. That's also, that's also what happens. For example, if you have your iPhone or something has a problem, I'm going to connect you to tech services. That's in Mumbai in India. So it used to be tech services, used to be in Seattle or something like that. So it was so much cheaper to have people who are just as technologically skilled who spoke English in Mumbai in India. And you could save roughly, probably $80 an hour per person by shifting your service center from Seattle to there. No one thought about it. The airlines industries are all based in Mumbai. If you have reservation issues or something like that, almost invariably the folks you talk to that are actually doing a lot of work are actually in India. So this is what we call outsourcing. The United States has probably been impacted the most by this, just because we are the most expensive in almost every aspect of this. And this is why when people say, well, if you don't buy stuff from China, then people are going to start producing in the United States. This isn't going to happen, because people in the United States don't want to pay the price of having Americans do it. So outsourcing is a reflection of a whole mess of issues, but it's basically driven by consumerism. The idea that people want to maximize what they get for minimize their cost. Production migration, that's what I just mentioned. Outsourcing is a really classic example of that. In the 21st century, this has basically been chasing cheap labor. Energy costs really aren't that different from one place to the other in most of the world. So in most cases, when a company moves its operations, Apple, for example, in the last 6 years is pretty much, well, Foxconn is the company that actually makes the phones for Apple. They're a Chinese company. But one of the ironies is for the last 20 years or so, they've been making iPhones for Apple. They've now moved almost all their production operations, or about 80% of them, down to Vietnam and Malaysia. Because just like every other company, they're chasing the cheaper labor. And there's also less regulation on how hard they make people work. So they can get more out of people at a much lower cost in Malaysia, for example, than they can in China. So what you find is a lot of migration occurs where factories will be around, and all of a sudden, poof, they're gone, and then factories will move somewhere else, chasing the labor. So it's not that the company closed in many cases; it's just the company moved because it was looking for a cheaper place to do business. To a certain extent, this is what you see when we eventually look at Gary, Indiana, and Detroit. The car companies that make cars, General Motors and Ford and stuff, they're still around. It's just they do most of their production in Southeast Asia and China, and especially in Mexico. So they're not producing anything in the United States. So they don't need factories in the United States. And also there's suppliers that are not going to be in the United States. So if you're someplace like Gary, Indiana, or Detroit, where you basically were the production center for auto manufacturing in the United States, then all of a sudden everything's gone. They've all left. And all those jobs have disappeared with them. And you have a highly skilled job force that suddenly has no one that wants those skills. And then that's the huge problem for a lot of what's called the Rust Belt, or the center part of the United States, is as production migration has occurred, you end up with a sort of vacuum because it doesn't get replaced by something else. You just have a ton of people out of work. Remittance systems, you see this classically, probably the most famous of these would be Dubai, but also other parts of Saudi Arabia, for example, these areas. But Dubai is probably the most famous. Basically, the folks in Dubai do almost none of the heavy lifting in terms of labor, construction, all sorts of stuff like that. That's all imported labor, largely from the Philippines and Indonesia. Indonesia because they're Muslim, Philippines because they speak English. So in that situation, what happens is remittance systems are basically, I move somewhere to get a job somewhere and I send the money back home. And the folks back home actually sort of ship me out for the purpose of generating revenue at my job and then coming back, and hopefully coming back eventually, but certainly the money's going back. That's how a large part of the population ended up here in Hawaii in the 19th and 20th century. They were sent over for the purpose of sending money back home. And that term in English is called a remittance. We send money home. You work somewhere else and the money goes home. In the 21st century, this is largely, the biggest, most spectacular example. This would be the Middle East, where, enormous numbers of folks in Kuwait and Dubai and stuff like that are from, countries in Southeast Asia or, island Asia, who then go to these places and then send money back home. Hawaii is a good example now because a lot of your folks from Micronesia, for example, or Samoa, are here because of the ability to make work, and then they send the money back home. Ironically, there's a fair number of folks in Hawaii that have had to move to the mainland and send money back here following the work. So remittance systems are basically, especially in the 21st century, between the fact that transportation is incredibly cheap, relative and fast compared to what it was even 50 or 100 years ago, and probably most important is because of global banking. We don't think about it, but you can go anywhere in the world and basically make a cash transfer. You can move money around. Couldn't do that 50 or 100 years ago. When I was a kid, you had traveler's checks because that was the only way you could move money from one location to another, because in many cases, they wouldn't accept the currency from another country. Nowadays, you just have your credit, debit cards, Amex, or whatever it is, and the money can be anywhere. So it means that I can be a Filipino, from North Ilocos Sud province, working in Dubai, and the money just gets transferred digitally to my family's accounts in wherever, Baguio or wherever I live in the Philippines. So that allows this almost instantaneous transfer of funds. Makes it a lot easier for me to work somewhere else because I know the money's going to get home, and the family's a lot more comfortable with that because they know the money's they get the money. It's not being like, cash in a sealed envelope sent home by mail. So remittance systems are very much they've been around for a long time, but in terms of very organized, structured ones, they're pretty much last half of the 20th and the 21st century. How long they're going to be around, hard to tell, but there's some societies that depend entirely on them. In the island Pacific, your Micronesian states and, for example, Samoa and Tonga have basically no economic system whatever. You have subsistence agriculture at home, but if anyone at the home territories if someone in Chuuk wants to buy anything, that's pretty much money from somewhere else on planet Earth, and much of that's going to be folks from Chuuk here in Hawaii working and sending money back to their relatives in Chuuk. That's going to make that happen. So Pacific Island states are almost entirely remittance driven. The Philippines and Indonesia are both somewhere in the range of 35 to 55% of their entire economic system is remittances. They're not particularly open about sharing that information because it doesn't look good, and it also makes them very vulnerable. So remittance systems are basically how things work for a lot of places, especially here in the Pacific. But they're relatively recent, and it's going to be interesting to see how long they last before a change in how production takes place. For example, as production or services become more automated, maybe the remittance systems are going to sort of start to disappear just because there isn't a lot of demand for them.